Okay, let's open our books up, please, to the doctor's opinion. And we'll be looking at either page 27, which would be XXVI, or 29 if you have the new book, XXIX. And before we go back into our reading of the doc's opinion, let's make sure we're on all fours here. Some of you may not have been with us before. Let's briefly recap what we found out so far. Dr. Silkworth, as we all know, was the director of Towns Hospital, a major hospital involved in the treatment of alcoholics and drug addicts, located in New York City, perhaps the best known hospital of its type at that time in the 1930s. Dr. Silkworth was the director. He was a guy who had been involved in alcohol and drug addiction treatment for 20 years before he wrote this opinion. So he was not somebody who was simply coming off the top of his head with some horseback idea. This was well thought out. His opinion carries a great deal of weight, and it really ought to have had the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1939, because he identified a disease that had never been identified successfully before. And of course, as you all know, subsequently the American Medical Association agreed with him. We found out from Dr. Silkworth that the alcoholic, the true alcoholic, the chronic like you and me, is a victim of a disease which is much like an allergy. That is to say that alcohol affects us differently than it does other people. And when we take alcohol into our systems, it triggers an allergic reaction of some kind. Not only does it make it difficult for us to stop drinking once we start, in fact for many of us impossible, but it seems also that alcohol has a much more deleterious effect on our brains and on our internal organs and our bodies than it does on other people. Aside from that, of course, that being the physical aspect of alcoholism, the doctor has also told us that we have an obsession of the mind and compulsion, which is a form of insanity that we cannot keep from taking the next drink. When the opportunity arises, or even if we have to go out and make an opportunity, we're going to pick up the drink again. And this in spite of the fact that we know from sad, long experience, maybe tragic experience, just exactly what the result is going to be. But the fear of the result of drinking does not keep any of us sober. And this is insanity which we cannot fight ourselves. Can't cure a sick mind with a sick mind. We're going to have help with that. Also, and this is directly applicable to the first step, we learned from the doctor that the real alcoholic, the chronic, can never safely drink alcohol in any form again for the rest of his or her life. Now, this may be a hard blow for some people who are coming in new, thinking that possibly we can teach them how to drink like ladies or gentlemen, thinking that somehow they can fake their way through and we'll sign their court papers, or we'll do whatever it takes to make the world out there believe that they're really serious about recovery. And then when they get their affairs straightened out, they'll go back out and be able to go back out and drink again. Some can, but not all. The real alcoholic cannot. And so going right immediately to the first step, what it tells us is that the delusion that we're like other people, or presently may be, has to be smashed. That many people have followed this delusion right into insanity and death. And so we find that we must accept as absolutely true that we can never safely drink alcohol again. The plug is in the jug. We're through forever. And unless we accept that, then our first step is never truly taken, because we take it with reservation. With the reservation being that somehow down the line you'll be able to drink again, and this means that we have disabled ourselves from having the full effect of the 12 steps in terms of removal of our insanities and our obsessions. Doctor went on to talk about the fact that the message, which will interest you and me as alcoholics, chronic alcoholics, has to have depth and weight, and that frothy emotional appeal will not suffice. Which of course means that it no longer is effective to come to us and tell us that we need to do better, that we need to pay attention to our families, that we need to pay attention to our job. What's the matter with you? Why don't you just stop? Don't you see what you're doing to other people? And so on and so on and so on. That doesn't seem to faze us a bit. So when we bring a message to the alcoholic, it has to have depth and weight, and most certainly that's the big book in the 12 steps, isn't it? Depth and weight aplenty. Dr. Silkworth then goes on to tell us about the people who are still out there, still in the throes of their addiction, will become restless, irritable, and discontent until they can again experience a sense of ease and comfort, which comes at once from taking a few drinks. Now, it's important for us to recognize that Dr. Silkworth here was not talking about alcoholics in recovery. He was talking about alcoholics who were not in recovery, who were still fighting on their own, trying desperately to control their drinking. What he's saying is, when these people become restless, irritable, and discontented, they will most likely pick up a drink because they know that's going to make them feel better right away. This does not apply to people in recovery, and I mean, it may sound like I'm picking at nits, but let me explain why. There's too much stuff going on around here that indicates somehow we can stay sober and recover based upon slogans and nice little acronyms and sayings. That's not so. Those things are misleading. If somebody were to say to me that if I don't get too restless, irritable, or discontented, then I won't pick up another drink, I'd say, well, that's foolish. It's got nothing to do with that. If I'm going to drink again, it'll be because my spiritual fitness has slipped all out, because I've rested on my laurels, because I'm going to drink again and no longer have God's protection, because I've never lost the disease of alcoholism. It's always there. It's put into remission as long as I stay in God's pocket, and no longer. Same category of stuff as hungry, angry, lonely, tired. It's a nice acronym. HALT. Oh, that's really great. The only problem is that doesn't work either, because we can be all four of those things, and included to that be restless, irritable, and discontented. Have all seven of those things, and we still won't drink if God's with us, if we're with God. And if we're not with God, we don't have to worry about those, because we're going to drink anyway. We'll do that all on our own. We don't need something to so-called trigger us. These triggers that they talk about all the time. You see, every time we get into this kind of stuff, we begin to fantasize that there's a human solution to this disease. There is not. And if we can just find out some way to keep from doing the things that will trigger us to drink, then somehow we won't drink. We've got to stay away from old playmates and playpens and all that stuff. Well, that's okay, I suppose, for the first 2 or 3 weeks until we get some spiritual feet under us. But we're not going to quit living lives just because we're alcoholics in recovery. The Big Book tells us the opposite. It says quite clearly that if we try to shelter ourselves from alcohol, it won't work. Because not drinking is not the answer. The answer is finding God, and we find God by working the steps. If we find God, we don't drink because our problem is solved. If we don't find God, we do drink because the disease is there and it's active, and it'll drive us right back into the bottle. There are codes that we must follow. There are spiritual principles which we must incorporate into our lives and deal with on a daily basis. If you want to call them rules or not, doesn't matter. Dr. Silkworth preferred to call them rules. Few simple rules. Now then, let's go on page 29 or 27, depending upon which book you have. Right in the middle of the page. Men have cried out to me in sincere and despairing appeal, "Doctor, I cannot go on like this. I have everything to live for. I must stop, but I cannot. You must help me." Now in chapter 8, chapter Wives, this person is defined as the person who wants to stop. And these people are coming to the doctor all day long. That's his practice is to deal with these folks. "I cannot go on like this. I have everything to live for. I must stop, but I cannot. You must help me." Now we know that this person is not as far advanced as many of us, because quite often before we get in here, we figure we have nothing to live for. We figure that we are hopeless, helpless. There's no way out for us. Going on, the doctor says, faced with this problem, if a doctor is honest with himself, he must sometimes feel his own inadequacy. Although he gives all that is in him, it often is not enough. One feels that something more than human power is needed to produce the essential psychic change. More than human power. See, Dr. Silkworth, by the time he wrote this in 1939, had been watching AA at work in his hospital for over 3 years. So he knew what was going on. He saw that these psychic changes were taking place, and he saw that they were not coming as a result of his ministrations or his people, his staff. They were coming about because of what the AA people were bringing to his patients. One feels that something more than human power is needed to produce the essential psychic change. Though the aggregate of recoveries resulting from psychiatric effort is considerable, we physicians must admit we have made little impression upon the problem as a whole. Many types do not respond to the ordinary psychological approach. And what he's really telling us here is that the alcoholics who came into his hospital were too far advanced. There was nothing he could do to help them, because they were not amenable to the human solution anymore. Also, you got to remember that Dr. Silkworth was getting a lot of patients who were heavy drinkers by definition, people who felt that they needed to dry out, or that maybe they were letting alcohol get away from them a little bit. And those people he could help, and he did. Going on the last partial paragraph on that page, I do not hold with those who believe that alcoholism is entirely a problem of mental control. I have had many men who had, for example, worked a period of months on some problem or business deal which was to be settled on a certain date favorably to them. They took a drink a day or so prior to the date, and then the phenomenon of craving at once became paramount to all other interests, so that the important appointment was not met. These men were not drinking to escape. Listen to this now. These men were not drinking to escape. They were drinking to overcome a craving beyond their mental control. Now, all of this stuff, as you can see, is very, very essential to the first step. Anybody who's brand new, who hasn't read this and isn't reading it, if you're sponsoring them, go through these things with them carefully, because this stuff is absolute dynamite. This is what breaks down the denial. This is what brings some understanding to the new person, that they're not dealing here with badness or lack of willpower, they're dealing with a disease. He goes on to say there are many situations which arise out of the phenomenon of craving which cause men to make the supreme sacrifice rather than continue to fight. I mean, this is pretty serious stuff. The supreme sacrifice he's talking about is drinking themselves to death. They would rather die than quit. And I'm sure there are people in here who have experienced something similar to that. I was talking to a guy yesterday who said that he was threatened with life imprisonment. And he was so sick, sore, and wounded from alcohol that he was looking forward to it. He would have a place to sleep, and 3 meals a day, and no responsibilities. In other words, he would be escaping from life into a jail cell, and that he was so far down that at that point that looked real good to him. I don't know if anybody in here has ever been that low, but I suspect some of you have been. And if you have, you know exactly what we're talking about. Would rather make the supreme sacrifice than to continue to fight. The classification of alcoholics seems most difficult and in much detail is outside the scope of this book. There are, of course, the psychopaths who are emotionally unstable. We're all familiar with this type. They're always going on the wagon for keeps. They are over-remorseful and make many resolutions, but never a decision. Now, I'm not sure what he meant by psychopaths. Maybe it's not the same way we use the term today. But remember, as we read chapter 5 at every meeting, that there are those too who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders, which would fall right within this. But many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. The one key. The psychopath who has the capacity to be honest can recover. Now we also know from our big book that when the spiritual malady is overcome, that we do straighten out mentally and physically. And we talked about this in the workshop today. There are miracles of recovery that have taken place in this fellowship that you wouldn't believe unless you had witnessed them. And the doctors and psychiatrists don't believe them at all. They have no explanation. But there isn't anything past God's power. The moment that we begin to circumvent or circumscribe God's power, put limits on it, of course we limit His ability to work with us, don't we? But there is nothing past His power. Now, I personally have seen recovery from physical ailments that were unexplainable on medical terms. It came about because God was working in this person's life. All right, let's go on here. There is the type of man who is unwilling to admit that he cannot take a drink. He plans various ways of drinking. He changes his brand or his environment. There is the type who always believes that after being entirely free from alcohol for a period of time, he can take a drink without danger. Now that's pretty common, you know. We get a lot of folks coming in here who really are carrying that idea in the back of their minds. And as we said before, they're not going to be able to take a proper first step because they're doing it with reservations. There is the manic depressive type who is perhaps the least understood by his friends and about whom the whole chapter could be written. Today we have a different word for that, different phrase, I forget what it is. Bipolar. Yeah, bipolar. And you know, obviously, as you look at me, I don't have a medical degree. I've never practiced medicine, nor do I intend to even try. But there are some things I know from having been around here a long time. One of those is that in most of the treatment centers today, they are specializing in bipolar, and the reason they are, from what I can understand, is that they cannot be paid for alcoholic recovery. There has to be some kind of a disease syndrome to be paid. And of course, if that's so, then the easy thing to do with any alcoholic is call them bipolar and start to medicate them. I think it's important for you, if you're new, to take a hard look at this possibility that you are going on the assumption that you have some kind of a dread bipolar disease, when in fact the real problem is that you're an alcoholic and that you're full of fear. because fear is that force which stands behind depression, stands behind it solidly. So there's a danger there that we will believe that somehow or another we can't survive without this medicine that they give us, when in fact the only thing we really need is to get right with God. Now, of course, it's not up to me or anybody else who's your sponsor or working with you to tell you that whatever you got to do one way or another. That's entirely up to you. You see, there's another fact of life here which we seldom hear about, but it's the truth. Our recovery, each of us individually, our recovery is our own personal obligation. We are responsible for our own recovery. We can't lay it off on anybody else. So it's necessary for us to take a look at these things and to decide for ourselves what we think we ought to do. And if we need some help or advice from people who've been there before, for goodness sakes, we get it. But it's talking about writing a whole chapter on a manic depressive. Now, manic depressive in those days was an identifiable disease, which was the symptoms of which were extreme agitation and mania on the one end of the scale, followed by a deep depression on the other side. And this cycle apparently is normal with all people, but in the psychopathic manic depressive it's exaggerated, so that in the mania phase they're very dangerous, in the depression stage they're dangerous to themselves and dangerous. They could very easily lapse into some kind of a depression from which they would not recover. That's what it used to be. I don't know, this bipolar stuff seems way too facile for me. But anyway, there's something to think about and something to consult with. You might want to consult with a family doctor. You might want to consult with somebody who's been there before you, who's already been through this, and see what their experience was. Going on, then there are types entirely normal in every respect, except in the effect alcohol has upon them. They are often able, intelligent, friendly people. And you know, there are a lot of us around like that. A lot of you folks would fit that category precisely. There isn't, you know, you dig around back there and you can't find all that much mess in your life. You did a lot of stuff really well, but somehow or another, alcohol has you by the throat. One of the things I've known and learned in here is that alcoholics, by and large, are pretty smart. There's a high degree of intelligence and a great deal of intuitive ability with alcoholics. I don't know whether that's necessary, but it seems to be typical. And so sometimes I think we're way too smart for our own good. And we like to try to figure things out rather than follow directions. And sometimes we're better off just following directions and doing what the people before us did. They recovered, now we can recover. And by the way, there is a complete description of these various types of alcoholics and the progression of the disease in the chapter to wives, beginning on page 108. Okay, all these and many others have one symptom in common. Listen to this: they cannot start drinking without developing the phenomenon of craving. This phenomenon, as we have suggested, may be the manifestation of an allergy which differentiates these people and sets them apart as a distinct entity. It has never been, by any treatment with which we are familiar, permanently eradicated. The only relief we have to suggest is entire abstinence. Can you see the doctor just putting his hands up and saying, I surrender? We've tried this. We've tried everything we know. We've tried hot baths and cold baths. We've tried belladonna poisoning. We've tried conditioning and Pavlovian theory. We've tried psychiatry. We've tried group therapy. We've tried encounter groups. We've tried all this stuff. We tried psychometrics. We even called in the acupuncturist and the hypnotist. And once in a while a psychic to try to find some way to help these people, but nothing worked. And we give up. What's he say again? The only relief we have to suggest is entire abstinence. Now this business of abstinence, you know, is pretty unusual actually. We think of it as being common because we're in AA. But for most people, the idea of having to be totally abstinent just doesn't occur to them. What they're really thinking is, well, you just ought to cut back. I mean, lots of people drink here and there. They have a drink and might leave half one on the table. They get a little tiny buzz and they feel good, and they get a little bit garrulous and they tell funny jokes and stuff. We ought to be able to do that too. Why do we over-drink? That was what my one and only wife, thank you, God, used to always say that to me, James, why do you over-drink? Well, she sipped on her Manischewitz wine and left half of it in the glass. She used to tell me I was crazy, but she's the one ended up in the nut house. So who was the crazy one in my family? I don't know. So the view, you see, that people have is not one of abstinence. Now, here's a kind of interesting historical fact. There used to be a movement in the United States back in the 1800s called the temperance movement. And the temperance movement was really a creature of the churches, and they wanted people to slow down. Temperance meant just don't drink so much, just don't get drunk. Never occurred to them that these people who were afflicted, these town drunks, had to quit altogether. Somehow or another, it seemed that they should be able to drink just a little bit here and there and kind of enjoy it. And you know, it's a funny thing. You go into many churches today where they're trying to help the alcoholics and addicts in their congregation. They got the same idea. Just cut back. Just don't use so much. Just don't drink quite so much. Well, you can do it. You know, you got God, you got whatever. Just ask for help. Just ask for help. I heard a sermon one time. Said, held up a glass of water and said, now, this is the drink you take. And he had his pitcher here. Poured another one. This is the drink you don't take. Hey, you wait a while. This is the drink you take. This is the drink you don't take. See how that works? That way you don't get drunk, you have a good time. That makes good sense, doesn't it? And all the congregants go, oh yeah, sure, preacher, that's right. These people didn't have the foggiest idea what goes on with us, did they? Can you imagine? you imagine an alcoholic, he's sitting there, or he or she's sitting there with a jug of martinis. Pour a martini, drink that, pour another one, pour it back in. No, we're not about to do that. Even if we run out of olives, we won't do that. Oh well. So what Dr. Silkworth is saying, what we know to be obvious, but it isn't obvious to the rest of the world. The only answer is abstinence, total abstinence. The plug's in the jug, we're through drinking forever. And so, if it makes you mad that we took away your bottle, hoo-ha, tough. That's the way it is. No more booze. Okay, open your books up, please, to page 28, XXVII or XXXX. Bottom of the page. We've just discovered that Dr. Silkworth has concluded that the only relief that's possible for a chronic alcoholic is complete abstinence. Going on, he says this immediately precipitates us into a seething cauldron of debate. Much has been written pro and con, but among physicians, the general opinion seems to be that most chronic alcoholics are doomed. Wow. An incurable, progressive, deadly disease. The only incurable deadly disease in the world that I know of which denies its own existence, hides from us, hides the facts from us, teaches us to deny and to rationalize and to become self-deluded about it, about the very existence of the disease itself. Top of the page. What is the solution? Perhaps I can best answer this by relating one of my experiences. Now it's interesting here because remember we've got a whole chapter called There Is a Solution. Dr. Silkworth is making it clear that he believes there is a solution. So what does this do to the apparent hopelessness that we carry in here with us? See how important it is for new people to read this, to become familiar with what's being said here, because there is hope for everybody. There is a solution. He goes on to say this: about 1 year prior to this experience, a man was brought in to be treated for chronic alcoholism. He had but partially recovered from a gastric hemorrhage and seemed to be a case of pathological mental deterioration. That's pretty serious. Now we're getting down to the point of feeble-mindedness. He had lost everything worthwhile in life and was only living, one might say, to drink. He frankly admitted and believed that for him there was no hope. Following the elimination of alcohol, there was found to be no permanent brain injury. He accepted the plan outlined in this book. 1 year later, he called in to see me, and I experienced a very strange sensation. I knew the man by name and partly recognized his features, but there all resemblance ended. From a trembling, despairing, nervous wreck had emerged a man brimming over with self-reliance and contentment. I had talked with him for some time, but was not able to bring myself to feel that I had known him before. To me, he was a stranger, and so he left me. A long time has passed with no return to alcohol. Remember what the promise is, guys, back there in the promises? That our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. Remember when we get to the third step, what it tells us? We were reborn. There's a total rebirth of thinking. Remember what it tells us, that when the spiritual malady is overcome, we will straighten out mentally and physically. You can watch the transformation of newcomers within weeks. Not months, but within weeks. The whole thing, their face changes, their expression changes, their carriage changes. Everything about them begins to change. There's a smile on their face, there's a lilt in their voice, there's optimism. Where before there had been a nervous, despairing, trembling wreck. And a lot of us in here have experienced that. We know what the doctor's talking about. Going on, he says, when I need a mental uplift, I often think of another case brought in by a physician prominent in New York. The patient had made his own diagnosis and, deciding his situation hopeless, had hidden in a deserted barn, determined to die. He was rescued by a searching party and in desperate condition brought to me. Following his physical rehabilitation, he had a talk with me in which he frankly stated he thought the treatment a waste of effort, unless I could assure him, which no one ever had, that in the future he would have the willpower to resist the impulse to drink. Well, I guess all of us have found out how illusory this idea of willpower really is. And yet so many people are insistent that we should exercise our willpower. And if we only had a little more willpower, a little bit more motivation, we would be able to stop drinking or modify our drinking. And yet we have to find out, and we have to accept the fact that there is no such thing as stopping drinking on willpower alone. His alcoholic problem was so complex and his depression so great that we felt his only hope would be through what we then called moral psychology, and we doubted if even that would have any effect. Now, moral psychology, you notice the use of the word moral there, because Dr. Silkworth was really not much into religion or religious ideas, but he was certainly a student of morals and ethics, and he believed in that. And he was right in the same class with some other psychologists and psychiatrists who were beginning to understand that in order for them to be effective with their clients and their patients, they were going to have to take into account the spiritual side of the patient's lives as well as the medical and mental side. Top of the page, next page. However, he did become sold on the idea contained in this book. He has not had a drink for a great many years. I see him now and then, and he is as fine a specimen of manhood as one could wish to meet. Now then, this last little sentence is so important, because we have to remember where it's coming from and the circumstances under which it comes. Let's see what Dr. Silkworth says. I earnestly advise every alcoholic to read this book through. And though perhaps he came to scoff, he may remain to pray. The last word in the doctor's opinion is pray. I earnestly advise every alcoholic to read this book through. Now, that's exactly what we learned in the 7th chapter. Please turn now to page 95. Page 95 is discussing how we work with a new person. We've taken him through as much as we can up to this point. We've told him about ourselves and how we drank. We told him about the disease. We told him how we recovered. On page 95, the 3rd paragraph. If he is sincerely interested and wants to see you again, ask him to read this book in the interval. After doing that, he must decide for himself whether he wants to go on. Please notice that the word "this book," it does not say some parts of this book or a Leader's Digest expurgated version of this book or an as your sponsor sees it part of this book, but the book. Read this book in the interval. And there's a very good reason for that. We'll discuss that in a minute. After doing that, he must decide for himself whether he wants to go on. He should not be pushed or prodded by you, his wife, or his friends. If he is to find God, the desire must come from within. And we forget that a lot, guys. Somehow or another, we think that we are so articulate and we are so convincing that we can take the new person and somehow or another talk them into the idea of working the steps and getting sober. The big book tells us just the opposite. If he is to find God, the desire must come from within. We cannot force any of this to happen.